let's get started with our next to last class on Psalms, amazingly. Um, so uh, I asked you all to look at three Psalms in preparation for today's class. And really, I just want to sort of talk through them and think about how to, again, like just read some Psalms together. And we'll do the same thing next time. This is one of the problems with talking about Psalms as a book is there is no really Psalms as a book. It's like, it would be like assigning, a collection of short stories and being like, let's talk about the overall message. But there isn't one, right? Um, it's just Psalms are read one at a time, and when we read them all together, we might see patterns that cut across a whole bunch of them, and we've talked about some of that. But in the end, right, like the study of the Psalms is really the study of individual Psalms one at a time. And what I'm trying to get across, and I tried a little bit last time talking about how poetry works. But I hope it'll be even more the case as we do this. I'm trying to get across really is like that these Psalms are just like so full of stuff to talk about, even beyond things like theology, which in a sense I'm like least comfortable talking about. But just to think about how they were constructed, poems as pieces of art, as which is what I was sort of doing last time. So let's jump in, and we'll just take them in order. And I want to start with Psalm 29. I'm going to put them up on the screen, one or two verses at a time, Hebrew and English, or English and transliterated Hebrew, as I did previously, so that I can sort of refer to the sounds when I need to, and we can talk about the Hebrew a little bit, hopefully in an accessible way. So let's start in on Psalm 29. I should say Psalm 29 is I teach the Psalm all the time. I think it is like this magnificent piece, and just a terrific example of a hymn, but probably more than that also. Um, so the poem begins in line one with what looks like an incredibly repetitive little bit here. Ascribe to the Lord, O divine beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. And I realize it continues going with the ascribe to the Lord, but I'll pause there for a second. Um, what's going on here in the first verse, where you've got the same words opening each line, is a really classic poetic device in the Bible and in Hebrew. The term we use to refer to it is called a staircase construction. Basically, the pattern is A, B, A, C, right? So A is ascribed to the Lord, B is O divine beings, A again ascribed to the Lord, C is glory and strength. And what you have in that sentence, right, with A, B, A, C, is sort of a poeticized version of kind of just a normal prose sentence that would just be A, B, C. Ascribe to the Lord, O divine beings, glory and strength. Right? That's the sentence that's like the sentence that underlies the poetry. Um, but so how do you take a basic sentence and you turn it into something poetic? This is the way that they do it a lot of the time. And we may see somewhat more of this over the next week or two. Um, but that's how this one starts. And again, this is really typical construction. Uh, so ascribe to the Lord, O divine beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Now hold on a second. What do you mean, O divine beings? The Hebrew there is B'nai Elohim, which could be taken very, very literally as like sons of God, but that's worse than divine beings. Divine beings here, and again, like I should tell you, I'm working here from the JPS translation with a few little tweaks by me. Your translation may vary. Um, but this B'nai Elohim, this divine beings, members of the class of deity is really what the sentiment of B'nai Elohim is. Uh, it's important actually that the psalm begins not only with the recognition that there are other divine beings out there, and which is not strange. I mean, I think, we sometimes stop for a second. We're like, wait, divine beings, but we know that like the Bible is full of divine messengers, and later there are clearly like angels of various types, with names, Michael and Gabriel, and certainly once you're into the Second Temple period and early Judaism and Christianity, the divine sphere is absolutely like massively populated. So fine. But the speaker here is calling not on his fellow Israelites, but on sort of the other divine beings to ascribe glory and strength to Israel's God. Right? Remember, every time you see the Lord, and I could have been more careful about translating the Lord all the time as into Yahweh, but remember, every time you see the Lord, that is the proper name of Israel's God. So all you members of the class of divine beings, you should be ascribing glory and strength to Israel's God, to Yahweh. It continues on with yet another ascribe to the Lord pattern. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. So like we've gone from ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, right? And even so now the first three words of line 1b are the same as the first three words of line 2a. But instead of glory and strength, we have this slightly less abstract his name. And remembering, of course, that like God's name, and again, we should remember, right? Like it's important at this point for it to be like Yahweh as opposed to Elohim, sort of God. The glory of his name, it has the name is really like almost a tangible thing for them. So ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, and then we change the pattern in the fourth one. Now it's bow down to the Lord, right? The to the Lord part is the same, but we've changed from ascribe qualities to God to a physical action. Bow down to the Lord, and then the last words, another sort of term for God's glory and majesty and holiness, right? Which we've already had. We've had glory and strength and the glory of his name, and now we get sort of this like the majesty of his holiness, something like that. You're not ascribing this to God. Maybe this is because this is something God already has, right? Holiness is almost like it's almost a tautology, right? Holiness is defined by being a quality of the deity. So we couldn't ascribe holiness to God, but we can bow down in the presence of that holiness. Okay, so three ascribes, a bow down, lots of holiness, and it's these other divine beings who are supposed to be acknowledging God's power, and I think that's an important way to open here. Okay, I'm gonna move along. Verse 3. So we had this like two-verse pattern structure with this patterned ascribe, 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 bow down to the Lord. And now we start sort of a new pattern of verses in this psalm. Again, my hope is that you might be looking at this also sort of in a split screen or a Bible in front of you, so that you can see all of it at once. I can't get it all on the screen. So a new pattern of verses, now beginning with the voice of the Lord, Kol Adonai. The voice of the Lord is over the waters, and the God of glory thunders, the Lord over the mighty waters. We've got thundering over waters, right? This is storm imagery. And there's a wonderful play here because the word kol, which is translated here as voice, is also the Hebrew word for thunder. Right? They understood thunder to be sort of divine voicing, which you may recognize from famously from the scene with the giving of the Ten Commandments, where God and Moses are sort of communicating, and Moses speaks, and God answers with like bakol, like in thunder, but also like that's God's voice, right? That's the voicing and that this is how it sounds to humans. So we have the voice of the Lord, which is also like the thunder of the Lord, the thunder of Yahweh, over the waters, right? So this is not this is not really abstract, right? We'll see some abstract waters actually in the next poem we look at. But here you've got we want to really imagine, right, imagine the Israelites sitting and sort of watching a storm come in. And in fact, if you've ever been in Israel or actually much of the Mediterranean, when a storm comes in from over the waters, it's a really visibly dramatic kind of thing. Right? You can watch this like storm cloud and the lightning and the thunder coming in off of the sea. That's what's being described here, right? This thunder is over the waters. Notice here how, again, I want to think about like patterns within and across verses. The voice of the Lord is over the waters, which is to say, the God of glory thunders. And then the Lord, right, thunders, I think understood, over the mighty waters. So you've got this like alternation of the voice of the Lord in the first line with just the Lord in the second one, in the third one, right? The voice of the Lord is over the waters, the Lord over the mighty waters. It's almost as if they're telling you that like the voice and the deity are the same, right? When you hear it, that's the presence of God. Right? You can't see God, right? We largely accepted biblical belief that you can't see God and live, but you can hear God coming, right? God is announcing his presence. Yahweh is announcing his presence as he comes in over the waters. I should say, right, you've also got here, you've got a typical thing that happens with biblical poetry, which is the repetition of the same word here, mayim, water, and then mighty waters, mayim rabim, right? What's happening there is something we talked about last time, right? It's been expanded, waters has been expanded into mighty waters in order to compensate for the gapping of, in this case, probably thunders from the previous line. But this kind of thing, you'll see places where it says things like, the sea, and then the next line it says like the Red Sea or the mountains, and then the next line it tells you like which mountains. This is like this expansion, repetition of a common noun, and then an expansion either with an adjective or a specification. That's a very typical poetic move in biblical poetry. The next verses, 4 and 5, I could get them all on the page. We're still going with the voice of the Lord. The voice of the Lord is power. The voice of the Lord is majesty, right? So we left behind, right? We moved into the storm god imagery, but here the poem, even as it recalls, as it continues the storm imagery, what the voice, the thunder, it's now calling us back to the first verse with those glory words, right? With strength and glory and majesty, right? Majesty is the same word from the end of line 2. So the poet has like opened with this invocation, right? Ascribed to the Lord, and now has moved on into this storm god sort of imagery description, but is connecting the things here. So you have like section 1, section 2 started, and now in the middle of section 2, he's wrapping stuff from section 1 in a clever way. So what are you supposed to think when you hear this thunder, right? That is divine power. That is divine majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks cedars, right? And here, hard not to imagine that we're thinking about like thunder and lightning, right? Shattering of trees. The Lord shatters the cedars of Lebanon. So not only do we have here a pattern we saw earlier, which is the voice of the Lord followed by the Lord, right? In other words, creating that identity of the two things. Not only do we have the pattern I just talked about, which is first it's cedars, now it's cedars of Lebanon, right? In other words, it's specified through expansion. That expansion of Lebanon is accounting for the loss of Kol, the voice, right? So there's gapping, there's compensation, there's like all the things that I've been talking about are happening at once. And the voice becomes the Lord, but also the storm has moved, right? It was out over the waters a second ago. Now it's over the land. Where is it? I can tell you exactly where it is because the poem tells us exactly where it is, right? The storm is now up in the north. it's in, right, we should remember, it's not Lebanon, the country. This is Lebanon, the mountain range, which is up in I mean, it's near Lebanon, the country, but they didn't know from Lebanon, the country, right? That was just like, that was Canaanite, that was, Phoenician. But the country Lebanon is named after the mountain range, the Lebanon. So this is where the storm is. It's moved off the water. It's now up north in the Lebanon mountain range, where it is like shattering the mightiest trees of the region, right? These are the trees, the cedars, the famous cedars of Lebanon that are used to build Solomon's palace. This is divine power understood through the forces of nature, which is, typical storm god imagery stuff. I'm going to move on to the next one because suddenly something's different, right? We don't have the voice of the Lord here starting our verse. We pick up Lebanon and Sirion, which is another name of a mountain range. These are like Lebanon and Sirion are like the two, again, and you can see obviously Lebanon and Syria the names of the countries come from these mountain ranges. These are these two great mountain ranges up north of Israel. And what are they doing? Like they're dancing, right? I think that what we have here with he makes Lebanon, the mountain range, skip like a calf and Sirion like a young ox. I think that what's being described here is like it's the poetic expression of like, when lightning flashes and it looks like things are dancing as a result. I think that's what's being imagined here. These like dancing mountains responding to Yahweh's awesome power. This is another great example, of course, of like of gapping, right? He makes to skip is this word vayarki dame, which is in the first one, the first line, but is gapped in the second line, and then we're left with just the mountain range and the animal. Okay, moving along, we're back to voice of the Lord. In verse 7, the voice of the Lord kindles flames of fire. The voice of the Lord convulses the wilderness. The Lord convulses the wilderness of Kadesh. Again, structurally, we've seen exactly the same thing already. The voice of the Lord alternating with the Lord, again, identifying the two. The wilderness in one becomes the wilderness of Kadesh in the second, right? Just where we lose the word voice, we get the expansion of specification. The voice of the Lord or the thunder of the Lord kindles flames of fire, clearly, again, lightning imagery, convulses the wilderness, probably, again, more of this, like the visual and the auditory sensations of a massive thunderstorm, as understood as the deity moving. And now, of course, moving, remember, it was in the water, and then it moved to the mountains, and now it's come south. It's down into the wilderness. So this storm is really sort of moving all over the place. The voice of the Lord here again in 29:9. This is our last voice of the Lord verse. The voice of the Lord causes hinds to calve. Hinds are like deer, and strips forests bare. And I'm gonna stop there, and I'll read the next line in a second. Right. So we've had all this geographical imagery, right? The wilderness, the waters, the mountains. Now we get animal imagery to go along with it. Now I'm not a cattle rancher, at least not yet. But my understanding is that what is described here is actually true. Like thunderstorms do in fact coincide with increased animal births. It's probably something barometric pressure, something. That's all the science I know. But I do think that I'm pretty sure that there is some like truth to this. But this is like this is sort of bringing it home, right? Like we've been moving through all the space, and now we're getting closer in. We're talking about animals, and amid, right? So we've got all this chaos and destruction. We have, the water is roaring, and we've got the trees shattering, and the mountains in the wilderness are convulsing and dancing, and the animals are giving birth. And amid all of this chaos and destruction, there is a place of peace. And that's Where? In the temple, in the very house of this destructive deity. And everyone who is there, right, all of those who are in his temple say, right, what they say is glory, which is, if you recall, precisely what in verses 1 and 2, the B'nai Elohim, the divine beings, were supposed to ascribe to Yahweh, right? I really think that here we can get a wonderful sense of like the liturgical use of this material. The idea that, right, they're standing in, what's imagined at least is them standing in the temple, right, praising God as this storm god. But here we all are, and we all say, and you can imagine even like the priest being like, and in his temple all say, and the people standing there all say glory, right? Which is the word that the divine beings are supposed to bring. Last couple of lines have a new pattern, right? Not with ascribe to the Lord, not with the voice of the Lord, but with just the Lord. And I think there's a real progression there, right? Like other people ascribe to the Lord, and then we sort of talk about like the experience of the Lord, and now we really get description of. So after all of this movement, right, all of this storming, here in verse 10, we get like the royal deity sort of in repose. The Lord at the flood sat enthroned or sits enthroned. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever, right? He's sitting above the flood, right? Here even is this like mythical water. And whenever you see references to God controlling water or sitting, as in the flood story, as in the crossing of the sea, as in the poetry here, as in like the Leviathan myth, right? We're talking about is the deity's like royal control over the chaotic forces of nature. So here, you know, all you see, it's almost like you see all that storm going on out there. Don't worry. Not only are we safe in here, but that's our God doing that. And our God sits enthroned above the flood, right? This chaotic water, not just now, but forever. And so we, the temple, right? We are now in the presence of the enthroned eternal king. And we finish by attributing strength, obviously, to Yahweh, right? Like that was verse 1 said, ascribe to the Lord, glory and strength. And now we ask, may the Lord grant strength, the same word, to his people, right? To us. In this psalm that's full of raging and thunder and storm, we ask for peace, peace for the people of Yahweh who are gathered in this temple, safe and sound. And the fact that it ends with shalom, right? May he bestow on his people, bless his people with peace. This is, I will say, this line is part of Jewish liturgy, but it's like I find it actually so much more powerful as it follows this this raging text. I think this is just a hell of a psalm, and I want to point our attention to one other aspect of it, which is like the overall structure, which I've alluded to a little bit. I'm going to say too much. A lot of poetic analysis starts and very often ends with like, oh, if I just figured out the structure of the thing, I've figured out what it means. So here's a psalm with really super clear structure. 2 verses of ascribe to the Lord, 3 verses of the voice of the Lord, 1 of whatever in the middle, 3 of the voice of the Lord, 2 of the Lord, right? Now, on a purely structural level, you would look at this and say, this is what we call a chiasm, right? A, B, X, B, A. Right? This is like as standard and beautiful and perfect a chiastic structure as one could ever ask for. And one might also think, when you see a structure like this, and people think this all the time, and it's totally typical, you might look and say, yeah, when you've got a structure like this, a chiasm, like an A, B, X, B, A pattern, right? Just in the abstract, like the most important part of the psalm would be that X in the middle, right? That hinge, the thing that like is our eyes are drawn to structurally. And that may sometimes be true. But it's not true here because the verse in the middle is that like he causes the Lebanon to skip like a calf verse, which is in no way the like content high point of the psalm. Um, uh, all of which is to say, like it's just a reminder that as we read the Psalms, like structure is a wonderful thing to think about. I think it's like a really lovely shaping of the thing, but it's not the same as meaning. Okay. Uh, that took a little longer than I expected it to. Uh, not that I think there's anything wrong with that. But I'm going to go on now to Psalm 46, and I hope I have time to do Psalm 47. And if not, you'll know now kind of what to do with it on your own. Okay, Psalm 46. So if you're flipping through your Bibles, flip to Psalm 46. If you have it out already, now is the time to look at it. Psalm 46. God is our refuge and stronghold, a help in trouble, very near. Okay, so it's a wonderful, interesting opening. Um, you've got some wordplay going on, right? God is our stronghold, Oz, a help, Ezrat, Bitsarot. I think there's lots of sound stuff going on. You've got stuff going on like the middle of this line is refuge, stronghold, help, and trouble, all of which I think go together, whereas the outside is God is for us and sort of very near, or like the actual near isn't exactly what it says. It says like very findable, like like the idea being that like accessible, right? When we're in trouble, we can count on this guy. And we might stop a second and think, okay, a psalm that starts like this: God is our refuge and stronghold in a help in a time of trouble. It sounds like a communal lament, right? It's us, our, we, and it suggests that there's trouble, like something is the matter, and what we're lucky because we have a God that we can count on. So I want to keep that in mind as we move through. I'm going to try and move through this a tiny bit faster than the last one. Therefore, we are not afraid though the earth reels, though mountains topple into the sea. Its waters, that's the sea's waters, rage and foam. In its swell, mountains quake. So it's something of a surprising turn. It sounded like the people were in trouble. Now it actually sounds, since we just read Psalm 29, we might be like, oh, this kind of just sounds like storm imagery again, right? Mountains toppling into the sea, waters raging, foaming, mountains quaking. That all feels similar, similar to the kind of nature convulsion of nature stuff that we saw in the previous psalm. So maybe we've got a similar situation, right? It's the people in the temple looking out and saying, "Boy, I'm glad I'm not out in that storm." I realize this is like a particularly apropos or maybe entirely inapt stuff to be reading, given what's going on in Florida right now. But looking out and being like, "I'm glad we're not in that." Our God thankfully protects us from stuff like this. What else is going on here? I mean, there's a ton of like internal to the verse here. There's lots of wordplay. Nira, Hamir, Harim, Yahemu, Yahmeru. Like there's all kinds of wordplay going on. This is all really classic. You can find this imagery all over the place. Mountains quaking, and we'll see mountains melting, and the earth melting, and mountains toppling, and this is all standard storm kind of language. So maybe it turned out this wasn't a communal lament. Maybe this was a hymn. Um, uh, but then I'm not sure, right? Because suddenly we get this somewhat strange line. There is a river, I guess, whose streams gladden the city of God. Okay, it's about Jerusalem, the holy dwelling place of the Most High. Definitely Jerusalem, definitely the temple. God is in its midst. Remember, they understand God to like actually physically dwell in the temple. It will not be toppled. Now, it might, I should say here, like toppled. That's the same word we had in the last line, right? Where the earth reels and the mountains topple. But this mountain, right? Mount Zion, the mountain of the dwelling place of God, right? This mountain won't topple. right? Why? Because God is in its midst. And that makes me think of line one, where God was like very near, very accessible, very findable. Um, and again, I hear the storm imagery and I see it, and I also can't help but feel like God will come to its aid by daybreak. Sort of also sounds like something really bad is happening out there, like there are attackers. Um, like this is a poem that I think at least is playing with this storm language as, shattering and breaking. It's got a militaristic sense to it, the storm language. It's causing nature to convulse. Um, and here I think it's almost taking up the storm imagery to apply it to potentially a military situation. And if I were being incredibly like picky about this, and if somebody forced me and I hope nobody ever would, I might suggest that in fact this psalm even like feels like it could come from not just a military threat, but like specifically the Assyrian military threat in the reign of Hezekiah. Why do I say something as crazy like that? Well, um, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, one of the cool tourist attractions is this thing called Hezekiah's Tunnel in Jerusalem, which is truly a tunnel from inside the old city, underneath its walls and out to the spring. That's a tunnel that's described in the Bible as the mechanism by which Hezekiah, feeling that like while the Assyrians were besieging Jerusalem, was like, in order to make sure that we still have fresh water, we're going to build this tunnel underneath. Now, again, maybe I'm overreading, but there's a river whose streams gladden the city of God, the holy dwelling place of the Most High. And maybe because of that stream exists, it won't be toppled. It feels almost like this is sort of like referring to it, but I might be saying too much. Maybe that's just me as I said, overreading. But again, it does feel like whereas the previous psalm was really about a storm, this one maybe not about a storm, but is using storm language to talk about an actual military enemy. Here's where I think it kind of gives it away in verses 7 through 8. Again, I got more toppling, right? But now it's not nature, right? It's nations rage, right? Nations like they're raging there. That's one of the things that the waters did. Kingdoms topple. That's the word that like the mountains topple, but not this mountain, right? He raises his voice and the earth dissolves. That's thunder and lightning, right? So that's his voice, his thunder, and the earth's dissolving. That's probably like what it looks like. Again, if you've ever been in Israel during a rainstorm, which means you were there in the winter, right? Like it's dry, it's dry, it's dry, and then it rains, and it's like it feels like the earth is melting, right? If the water comes down from the mountains. It's a striking visual thing. Um, so I've got the storm imagery of like the thunder and the earth dissolving, but now I'm pretty sure that this isn't really about a storm anymore. This is about God protecting Jerusalem in the face of a military threat. And that's enforced by the name that's given to God here, the Lord of hosts, Adonai Tsebaot, right? Hosts, if you weren't aware in this like relatively common name for God, hosts is military hosts, right? God, that's the word for armies, right? So this military deity is with us. Our haven, right? And haven is like calls back not word for word, but to the opening line, right? God is our refuge and our strength, right? Now our haven is the God of Jacob. So you've got like this at the beginning of the line, right? God is our refuge and our strength. And at the end here, at least the end of what we've read, our haven, right, with us, right? There's this us that is the beginning and at the end that's around for framing all this natural imagery. Where is the us? Surely it is. They are also in Jerusalem, probably in the temple, in this haven, right? This unshakable, undefeatable mountain of God's dwelling. So again, we're combining what feels like like a lament, like a save us, with a hymn to God's power that combined, I think, remember last time or two times ago I said, right, like we shouldn't think of genre as like every poem has to be exactly one genre. It's the artistry is really in playing with the genre. And here's such a wonderful example. It's like it's the hymn storm god language, it's the communal lament save us language combined to give a sense of like, yeah, it may be bad out there, but God is actually in control. And our God is it will protect us. And that comes even more to the fore when we move on into the second part of the psalm. Um, in verse 9, we get this really a pretty abrupt shift in tone. It no longer are we talking about like God is our refuge, God is our strength, God is our haven, God will save us. Suddenly now it's like it's as if the storm has passed. Right. Now that's a shift. We talked about that a few weeks ago, in these Psalms of individual lament, where they're like, God, please save me. And then it says something like, and I know that God has heard my plea and everything is now okay. Same thing here. Communal lament, God will rescue us, to now it's definitely done. Right. Come see the completed deeds of God. Um, right. In other words, there's a narrative here. There's a story that's being told. And there's an expansion. It's not just God protecting Jerusalem. He has wrought desolation on the whole earth. And that's a wonderful line. That second line is wonderful to say out loud. Asher sam shamot ba'aretz, right? Like the first three words all sort of blend together before we get to on the earth. Um, Again, like the notion is, oh boy, you see all this stuff, this terrible thing is happening outside us, like this threat, this external threat. But not only is God protecting us here in Jerusalem, here, like in his temple, but actually all that destruction you see out there isn't a foreign enemy coming to attack us. This is our God is the one actually doing that. Right. So again, it's very much like Psalm 29, which was entirely, I think, sort of natural storm imagery, where they're like, oh, it's terrible out there, but it's cool. We're safe in here. Our God is the one doing it. The same thing is true here, even when it's military. Um, and again, I'm pretty sure it's military when I get here. He puts a stop to to wars throughout the earth. Okay, that's sort of utopian, fine. But we're definitely not talking about Israel or Jerusalem anymore. Now it's God as like worldwide bringer of peace, although we'll admit that he's bringing the peace through violence. Um, now we get the language that, if you remember from Psalm 29, is language that we know from like the storm god stuff, right? He breaks, right? If you remember, he broke the cedars of Lebanon, right? He snaps, right? He shatters the spear. He burns in flame, right? So like this is all totally normal storm god imagery, except that it's not talking about trees and nature and whatever. It's talking about tools of war. He's breaking the bow and the spear and the wagon. Um, so it's like it's again. I think I was just talking to one of my doctoral students today about how much I love. I was thinking about it because of this class. How much I love this psalm, and familiar even perhaps to you, having read Psalm 29 just now. It's this familiar language of storm, but it is like it turns out as you read, it's not about that at all. It's just using that language to get across this hymnic notion of a God who is in control of things that are terrifying. Um, and then the ending, like completely wild, right? We've had, we anyway, out of nowhere, we get this like the voicing of God in the first person. Stop. Like leave off and know that I am God. Who is God talking to there? It would certainly, I would think, not be the speaker of the psalm, not the people who are praising God here, but it's as if the psalmist is giving voice to God, who is telling presumably the enemy to just give up, right? Give up. Realize that I am God. I dominate in the JPS translation. True, literally, I am like elevated above the nations. I am high above the earth. That's what God says. That's God's language. Um, uh, this this notion of like suddenly a really like a transnational universal deity, right? A deity who's really in control of all the things. You think you're attacking, stop, right? I'm bigger than your national concerns. I'm bigger than the whole earth. Um, and then, of course, it ends with a repetition of what we had in line 8. The Lord of hosts is with us. Our haven is the God of Jacob. Uh, that repetition really like it sets off these last 3 lines as being something different, right? If the poem had ended in verse 8 with these last lines as we had them before, again, it would feel very much like oh, we're really in trouble, right? Like, but we trust that God will save us. And then it's like maybe it's after the fact, maybe it's like a real expression of hope. But anyway, but these lines that then come after that are again framed by that same concluding line. It's like now the Lord of hosts is with us, our haven is God of Jacob reads very differently after we've gotten God say, everybody stop, I've got this thing. Um, it's anyway, I think it's I went through it faster, and there's as always infinitely more to say about these. But I really loved the progression from Psalm 29 to Psalm 46 because I think that you can really see how like a very traditional hymn, how that idea and language can be taken up in a completely different way that like still resonates, right? Like everyone will hear the storm god stuff, but it's very clearly, in fact, a communal lament or a communal psalm about military threat. Can tell you what, I'm going to run real quick through the 47, um, and then I'll look and see if there are any questions. There's a couple, so I don't feel too bad. I'm going to have time. Really, I'm going to zoom through a tiny bit here. A very different psalm, and the thing that I want us to keep our eyes on throughout here. There's a key word that runs through, and the word is al or Allah, and it's the word that means above or upon or elevate or go up. Um, and it is this I like this song because it's a real demonstration of like what you can do with one word that sort of like winds its way through the entire thing in lots of different forms, which is something that you can do in Hebrew better than you can in English. Okay, all you peoples, clap your hands, raise for God a joyous shout. Okay, so I've got like again, who are the addressees? All you peoples, all the peoples. Presumably, this is again calling on God's sort of universal power. Like why? For the Lord Most High, ding, that's your first use of al. Elyon, right? Most High, which I think we've talked about actually before. For Yahweh, the Most High, Elyon, is awesome, which really means greatly fearable. Great King over all the earth. So really, we're going for the sort of universal deity here. Moving on. He subjects peoples to us, nations beneath our feet. Um, we the other things going on here in this poem, aside from the above all talk going through, is there's like a constant up and down. So I had God up above, right? God is above everything, and now nations are beneath even our feet, not beneath his feet, but beneath our feet, right? So we went from up to down. Uh, and it's also it's nations, right? Like the Amim who were called upon in the first line to acknowledge God's kingship are now the ones who seem to be subject even to Israel. Okay, he suggests peoples to us, nations are beneath our feet. He chose for us our heritage. So us, lots of us. Who's us? The pride of Jacob, whom he loved. So we've got like a definition here, right? Like it's we are in fact the ones who are selected, and this may be calling on a little bit alluding to this notion of like there's lots of peoples and lots of peoples with lots of their gods, but what's the uniqueness of Israel and this is reflected back in Genesis with Abraham, the uniqueness of Israel is that unlike all of the other peoples and their deities who just go back forever, right? Israel's God chose Israel, right? Selected Israel out of the other peoples. This is this is the chosen people trope, but it's really coming out here, right? Like he chose us for our heritage. He chose for us our heritage. I have a deep suspicion that it's probably as his heritage, and it's not a mistake, but it's a correction of sorts. He chose us, right? We are the ones whom he loves and prefers. That's the sense here. Again, there's a contrast of all the other peoples and Israel. Here we are in the center of the psalm. God ascends, Allah goes up amid acclamation, teruah. That's like a noise sound, a noise word, just like we had in the beginning of the psalm, right? Like everyone raise a shout. The Lord ascends to the sound of the horn, right? Here it's teruah and shofar and hariu. These are all like sound noise instrument words. So here we are like literally in the very center of the psalm. It's not a chiasm, but like there's a central statement here, I think. We want the acknowledgement of God's power. We want to acknowledge that people are subordinate to us, that we are awesome. But the moment of the psalm is God ascends, right? Goes up. And I think what we're talking about here is enthronement, right? That you imagine in the temple, right? This is like the notion of the deity entering. There's a real sense of performance here. I can imagine, I'm totally imagining, but I can imagine the congregation whoever is performing this sort of turning either to the entrance of the temple or perhaps to the center to like acknowledge the arrival of the deity. And of course, like we were up and we were down, and now we're back up again. So there's that pattern going on. Here, the God has now arrived and has been is beginning the enthronement process. And here, what should you do? You sing to God. Here's this verse, a very different tone, right? Like command, sing to God, sing to our God, sing to our King. Who is being told to sing? Is it the peoples from line 1? Is it the community of worshipers who are standing there now watching? That's my suspicion is the latter, but it's not clear. A real progression here. This is not unlike the beginning of Psalm 29. Sing, oh sing, sing, oh sing, sing, and then a sort of an outstanding line. For king over all the earth is God. Again, this enthronement kingship language. This is such a repetitive verse, right? If you look at all the words that are repeated, sing, God, right? I guess those are the main ones. But like, if this is a case where like, if you were to like take the repeated words as like almost canceling each other out, what's being said here? Sing to God, our King, over all the earth. Or sing to our God, or God, who is our King and over all the earth, right? That's like everything else is repetition. That's the core sentence here, which again, right, like thinking about the way the psalm has been shaped from the beginning, right? Like there's other peoples who are supposed to acknowledge God's kingship. There's us. We are God's chosen people. So here, sing, our God is king over all the earth. And in the last couple of lines, we get what I think is the completion of the enthronement process. God now reigns, right? Sits enthroned over all the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Again, every time it says over here or on, this is the word al, above, on top of. That's elyon. That's Allah goes up. This is like the key word of the psalm. It's in virtually every single line, right? God reigns over the nations again, right? Like talking about our God, who is sitting here on his throne, is in charge. The last line is a funny one. We're talking about the nations again. The great of the peoples, the amim, the nations, are gathered together. The people of the God of Abraham. For to God belongs the earth. And I'll just say that the last line, he is greatly exalted, is what ties it all together. That's again our Allah, our al word, right? In the passive. but he is exalted, he is arisen, he is on high very much. It's like it's almost like that's the title of the psalm. My question here, and I really don't know the answer, and I sort of go back and forth about how to understand it, is at the beginning of this verse, who are these? What's understood here, right? Like the great of the peoples, so the leaders perhaps of the peoples are gathered together. And what's the connection of that with the people of the God of Jacob? There's a couple of possibilities. One is, this is a little bit off kilter, one is that the there for people of the God of Abraham should actually be the word im, which means with. The great of the peoples are gathered together with the God of Abraham, right? In other words, they've kind of converted. It's possible that what's being imagined here is like heavenly beings, maybe, right? Like that's what the great things of, or the leaders of the people being imagined. Um, but in fact, it may just be that the great of the peoples are gathered together as the people of the God of Abraham. In other words, it is like a notion of like once they recognize God's kingship, which is what the psalm is calling for, they will become the people of the God of Abraham also. Anyway, there's lots of possibilities for what to do here. Honestly, it's a funny psalm because, like, in a sense, like conceptually, I think it's kind of bland. It's like, yes, God is the great king, and you all should worship him too. Is kind of the sense of the thing. Um, and the language is relatively standard, but there's this really wonderful, as I sort of said, this thread of this use of al to go up. Um, and this notion like they're called upon to sing, and the singing leads to the ascent and the enthronement, and there's more singing. There's lots of talk of peoples and earth, and in the very middle of the psalm, God ascends and everyone sings. God is king, everyone sings. God reigns over the earth. Right? It has a shape to it, even if it's not as clear a shape as Psalm 29. Let me look at the few questions that have come in as I realize I've taken up most of our time. Thankfully, there aren't so many questions, so I don't feel like I've gone too much, even if I may have gone too fast. So somebody asked, and I think it's probably may have been asked before I even said it out loud, but like sort of about the waters in Psalm 29 and the flood language in I think that's in the others in the Psalm 46 that it reminds us of the flood story, and I think that's exactly right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think that's exactly right. Again, I don't think it's the case that we should assume that in ancient Israel they would have been like, I heard the word flood, so I think of the flood story in Genesis. For sure, we do because we sort of read canonically across the whole, and we're typically looking for these kinds of connections. So I'm not sure that I would say that like hearing about the waters or would have led an ancient Israelite to be like, ah, yes, that story. But I think all of those stories and all of those the poems, the stories, it's in prophetic texts too that talk about God's command over waters. I mean, yes, creation in Genesis 1, Leviathan talk, the flood story, the crossing of the sea, the splitting of the sea, right? All of those are really participating in a common tradition that in Psalms and poetry is often expressed as like this, as like God is seated above the flood, right? God has control of the waters. It's not just in Israel, right? This is, as certainly as you may know, right, goes back to Mesopotamian creation myths, where their deity controls and defeats the water. It's Canaanite myths that have a war between Baal, the Canaanite deity, and Yamu, which is the Hebrew word Yam for sea, who is a deity for them, and they've got battles. This is common mythological stuff, and we're seeing it pop up in different kind of manifestations, which I think is nice. This is I'm going to answer this question because it's like incredibly specific and also super useful. The question was in Psalm 29, verse 3, somebody said, my translation says many waters, not mighty waters. which one is correct? And I appreciate the question because it's a good reminder that, you know, any single translation you read is by definition idiosyncratic, right? That uh, the only real text is the Hebrew, and even that's not so like, I don't want to like talk about how perfect the Hebrew is because it's had 2,000 years to go wrong in lots of different ways. Um, but any given translation, especially if you're working with the NRSV or the JPS translation, right? These are like the gold standard academic translations. And they're not going to agree on everything because if they did, then why would we have two of them? Um, but they're both really good, right? Neither one of them is like making mistakes. They're just recognizing that there's not a one-to-one equivalence of Hebrew to English most of the time. There's certainly a variety of ways to do this. Um, the word there that's being translated, like the adjective with waters, it's mayim rabim. It can mean great or it can mean many. And you have to decide as a editor, as a translator, which one you think fits better. But in Hebrew, they didn't have to decide, right? Because their word rabim had both ideas in it. So, we shouldn't be trying to figure out necessarily which translation is correct, but this is the advantage of having multiple good translations to compare. We might think to ourselves, well, what is it about, like what aspect of the word or what aspect of this line is this translation bringing out that this one's missing, and vice versa, as a way of recognizing that like Hebrew as a language um, is simply, I don't want to be like Hebrew is a richer, more beautiful language. It is, but it has many fewer words to express the same amount of stuff. Not all the same amount of, it's not like a Hebrew word for telephone. But like the same basic like range of ideas, and certainly lots of nature stuff. I mean, they've got all of the words, but they've got more meanings packed into individual words than we do, right? We have a much more expansive vocabulary that allows us to speak with incredible precision, right? Like, we can talk about the tiny little difference between this word and that word that are otherwise almost identical in their meanings. In Hebrew, almost most of the time, there's just one word that covers all of the possible like ranges of nuances, which makes it an enormously poetic and evocative language, and a rich and a very deep one, but also one that is incredible to translate. At least difficult to translate without extensive annotation that shows us all of the possible things and echoes that we might be missing. So my suggestion is not to pick up any single translation and be like, this is the good one. Now I know what it means. But find yourself a bunch of different ones. There are websites for this. Find a bunch of different ones and see what you see, and think about how that all might be packed into the Hebrew that's being translated. Very last question. Somebody said, I have a Bible with English and Hebrew side by side, but is there a version like the one that you keep putting on the slides with its like Hebrew with the English and transliteration? And I don't know. I don't think there is one. But my guess is almost everything exists on the internet now. So I would probably look there and see if you can find such a thing. And also, I would see if you can, I would look for one that, with any luck, is being offered, like is from a reliable source and doesn't say something like, I love the Bible.net. Just like, you want to be able to trust it. And again, I wish I knew of something like that. I think it's actually, it's useful, but if somebody finds one, let us all know.